hopefully everybody can see the slides. It's so lovely to be presenting to you today about regulation that doesn't directly impact you. It has an impact on, bear with me just 2 seconds. Have you got your, I've got an echo here. Is that on your side, Jamie?
Shouldn't be.
I can hear myself twice. It's bad enough hearing myself once. If everybody could just, don't know what could be causing that. Is everybody muted?
Everyone's muted.
How bizarre. Well, hopefully you can hear me. I'll just have to put up with the echo on this side. Yes, so as I said, it's wonderful to be presenting to you today about regulation that doesn't directly impact you, but rather it impacts the platforms that perhaps your businesses rely upon. Okay, so it's not too heavy today, which is nice to be able to say. I've put together a brief agenda, so we'll talk a little bit about what is the EU Digital Services Act. We'll talk about the kind of companies and platforms that are within scope. We'll look at some of the brands that are within scope, and you can actually see the myriad of brands that have kind of appeared and disappeared over the course of the last few years. And then we'll take a deep dive into the certain obligations that are impacting the platforms themselves and how that will impact our UK online sellers here. So how the platforms needing to comply with stricter, more robust regulation, how that impacts those downstream traders, if you like. And then we'll talk about a global perspective. So, you know, it's always nice whenever we talk about EU regulation, and I always say it, they're always spearheading. It's always they're always at the forefront of new regulation, but global markets typically adopt that regulation or closely aligned to that regulation within their own internal market legislation. So pinning your colours to the EU mast is always a good strategy, if you like, for being able to comply globally as you expand your export markets. So we'll talk about practical steps to prepare for that increased regulation that those platforms are facing. Okay, so what is the EU Digital Services Act? Well, EU Digital Services Act. So it's part of the EU's broader digital services package, and it runs alongside the Digital Markets Act. So it modernises the 2000 e-commerce directive. As you can appreciate, that's been in circulation for a long time and is no longer fit for purpose. It maintains what we call the country of origin rule. That just means that platforms or marketplaces are regulated by the law or by the law of the country in which they reside, not on where their users reside, if that makes sense. It introduces a lot more supervisory oversight or supervisory architecture for what the EU refers to as very large online platforms, or VLOPs, or very large online search engines, VLOSs, if you like, another acronym to get our heads around. So there's a lot more supervisory architecture, a lot more explicit regulation that govern the practices of those platforms. And fundamentally, you know, as with every piece of EU regulation, albeit it gets a bad rap, there are usually quite pragmatic reasons for the introduction of that regulation. So the Digital Services Act, you know, fundamentally it wants to create a more safe and trusted online environment. So it wants to better regulate illegal content, the advertising of goods and the advertising of services. It wants to strengthen user rights. Now, user rights, you could argue, are the end consumers that are purchasing the goods, but also users could be traders that are actually using those platforms to sell their goods and services. So it wants to strengthen the rights that users have. It wants more transparency around content moderation, around the ability to challenge platform decisions. So you know, if for argument's sake you have some content removed from a social media platform, or you're asked to remove your product listing from an online marketplace platform, you actually have more rights to challenge those platform decisions. There needs to be a lot more, and this is something that goes back to a big piece of research that the EU Commission did several years ago around transparency of algorithms. Okay, so depending on the different platforms you use, like obviously being a business user, we use LinkedIn. I'm terrible at updating LinkedIn, but I do use it. And just as you get your head around what the algorithm likes, they go and change it again. There needs to be a lot more transparency around algorithms, especially around recommendation systems. And we've seen a huge increase in what's called influencer marketing over the last few years. And the DSA aims to provide a lot more transparency around those recommendation systems and that kind of like ad targeting that you get that can be really quite annoying. There's a big shift in the regulation to focus on protecting minors, so prohibiting targeted advertising based on minors' personal details, so having that protection there for minors. As I said before, the very large platforms need really to have more accountability, and they need to be better regulated. So now the DSA will insist that they do risk assessments, that they have regular internal audits, and that there's just increased oversight into their practices and their processes and how they safeguard their users. And then obviously, you know, there has been a lot in the press over recent years around you know, systemic risks such as misinformation or disinformation, any kind of election manipulation, which is particularly interesting today because we vote here in Wales for the Senedd election tomorrow. So elections are spinning around my head. And already, you know, on social media, we can see stuff, especially with the introduction of AI, right, that you're questioning kind of every piece of content that you consume. Is that real? Is it AI generated or what? It's created an entirely different online experience, AI. So the DSA aims to kind of combat those systemic risks like that disinformation, that election manipulation, cyber violence, and so on. And importantly for you guys that you're selling via online marketplaces, so much of EU regulation is about traceability back to source and about verifying data that traders provide and so on. So platforms are going to be regulated in terms of how they improve the traceability of traders on using their platform. And they can now routinely conduct what we call product compliance checks, which could be completely random. But obviously, if you're not compliant in terms of your product listings, then they have the powers to remove that product listing, if you like. As with all benefits of innovation come you know, like digitization and AI, come the risks that those pose as well. So the DSA focuses very much on spread of illegal content that might be linked to fraud or unsafe products, disinformation and manipulation of public debate, which you see around election time, any kind of harms to minors. So that could be addictive design or harmful content. You know, we read awful things in the news about you know, kind of like suicide trends for youth, and you know, all sorts of content that can be harmful to our minors. And so the DSA places a lot more how could you say, onus on platforms to moderate that content and remove that content. There's a lot happening. The regulation is already in place. It's been in place since February 2024. I would say that the emergence of GPSR in late 2024, we saw possibly a lot more, how could you say, a lot more enquiries coming to us through them having been contacted by their platforms, by the Amazons, by the eBays, by the Etsy's, which would suggest that the platforms were actually realizing that actually they had a role to play in the regulation, and they were vetting their sellers to make sure that they were compliant with GPSR. So it is starting to bite. But as with any piece of regulation like this, it takes platforms some time to actually, get ahead of it and start implementing the things that they need to have in place. It doesn't exist, the regulation, as with all EU regulation, doesn't exist on its own. So it's connected to a number of different pieces of regulation around digital frameworks. So it repeals the 2000 e-commerce directive, but it works closely with the Digital Markets Act, the AI Act, which is a big topic at the moment. I think we've got a webinar planned on it over the coming months. The Data Governance Act, the Data Act, but then it also interfaces with GDPR as well around privacy and data protection. It interfaces with other what we call sector regulation, the Audiovisual Media Services Directive, the Terrorist Content Online Regulation, Copyright Directive, and so on. So as with every piece of EU regulation, there's a kind of complex matrix of how they all interface with each other, which one takes the lead, which one complements, which one needs to be adapted to incorporate elements of the other, and so on and so forth. It's not to be confused with the Digital Markets Act. So we've had conversations with clients before that have said, but that's the Digital Markets Act. It's not to be confused with that. The DSA is about online safety. It's about content moderation. It's about transparency. It's fundamentally about user protection. Whereas the Digital Markets Act is around competition, market fairness, limiting the power of gatekeepers. They actually kind of complement each other. DSA protects users and DMA protects markets. Okay, so that's the EU Digital Services Act, kind of like in a nutshell, what it's about. So which companies are within scope? So it's so lovely to be able to say, actually, it's these guys, because I doubt there's any of these guys on this call today. But you as businesses and UK SMEs and so on are kind of indirectly within scope if you use one or several of these kind of companies that are in scope. So social media platforms, absolutely first and foremost. So they're those platforms that allow users to create, share, interact with content and with each other. Why are they impacted? Well, because they host massive volumes of user-generated content. So the DSA actually imposes strict rules on illegal content removal, algorithmic transparency, ad targeting, and protection of minors, like I mentioned in the previous slide. So social media platforms are very much within scope. Online marketplaces, absolutely. Those of you on the call today, I presume, are selling into the EU via online marketplaces. So they're those platforms that allow consumers to buy goods and services from you guys, those third-party sellers. So they could be large e-commerce platforms, they could be cross-border marketplaces in the EU, they could be second-hand or peer-to-peer selling platforms. So, the last few years we've seen the massive emergence of those second-hand platforms that allow and actually fit quite nicely with the EU's kind of like circularity economy, if you like. They want to promote the greater life cycle of products. So those platforms are really important. Why are they impacted by DSA? Why are they within scope? Well, because they have to now, under DSA, very strictly verify traders. They have to check product safety, they have to remove illegal or unsafe goods quickly, and they have to provide clear information about sellers. So on those product listings, all of the information that's on those product listings that is provided to the consumer or the business customer in certain circumstances must be absolutely clear, legal, and verifiable. App stores also are within scope. So they're those kind of digital distribution platforms that allow users to download or purchase apps or digital services, or allow businesses to upload their apps to sell. So they act really as gatekeepers for software distribution, and they, under DSA, must provide more transparency, more fair treatment of the developers that use those platforms, and proper handling of illegal or harmful apps. So app stores are very much within scope of this regulation. And then we've got hosting providers. So, you know, we who do we use here? Microsoft's OneDrive. You know, we are totally reliant on OneDrive. They're very much within scope. So they're those services that store, host, or process information on behalf of users or businesses. So why are they impacted? Well, they must act upon notices of illegal content. They've got to maintain clear terms of service, and they must provide transparency around moderation tools and processes as well. So they're very much within scope. And then finally, search engines. So you know, from the big ones like Google, Yahoo, Edge, and so on, they're those services that index and retrieve information from the web, from or from within a platform ecosystem, if you like. Why are they impacted by DSA? Well, they influence access to information at scale. Okay, so the DSA requires full transparency around how they rank certain sites, so their ranking systems, to their advertising practices, and any systemic risk assessments for particularly for those very large online search engines. So they're kind of like the big five that are impacted by DSA. But then obviously, as they are subject to greater regulation themselves, then they rely upon the businesses using their services to be compliant also, so that they're not exposed to any non-compliance costs or risks of non-compliance, if you like. I've just put in a slide here. It's from the EU IPO. It just illustrates kind of like some of the brands that fall within the DSA scope over the last few years, as it's transitioned from the e-commerce directive along to the DSA. So we're going to do a deep dive into kind of like the obligations placed on those five kind of company types and how it might impact you guys as UK sellers that are interfacing with those platforms to reach EU consumers or EU business customers. So the first one is increased vetting and ongoing policing of businesses using the platform, or know your business customer. So platforms now under DSA have got to ensure that consumers know who they're buying from. So on an e-commerce platform, if you have a product listing and you have information about your company, it must be accurate, it must be verifiable, and that's the platform's obligation to make sure that you're compliant in that respect. They've got to thoroughly vet your identity as a trader before allowing you to sell. If they're not doing that, they absolutely should be. They will request certain trader information from you, which as a minimum would be kind of like your contact details, your company registration number if applicable, bank account details. Obviously, if you're selling product, then there's going to be stuff like self-certification of compliance with the EU product rules. And then they have an obligation in the event of that information not being available to basically remove you from their platform, suspend your trading if you consistently provide false or inaccurate information. And we covered a lot of this with GPSR because it kind of brought it to the fore. But essentially, consumers interacting with your product listings must be able to clearly identify who you are as a trader. Okay, so essentially the DSA in that respect helps to reduce that kind of like anonymous content or those fraudulent sellers, and increases accountability for unsafe or illegal goods that are placed on these platforms. Okay. Then we've got stricter adherence to data processes and compliance governing products and services listed on programs. So online marketplaces have to provide that kind of like clear, accessible information about products sold by third-party traders, you guys. So they must display essential information required under EU e-commerce, EU EU consumer and product safety laws. So GPSR brought a lot of this to the fore, as I say, but if a product that's being sold on an online marketplace is subject to EU safety or compliance requirements, the platform must show that detail. So, it must show that that there is CE markings, safety warnings, age restrictions, product origin information, which is really important. And platforms have a responsibility to notify consumers when a product is recalled or found to be unsafe. And if a product is illegal or unsafe, platforms must notify all affected consumers who purchased it. So again, we covered a lot of this with GPSR. Online platforms obligations make up a significant chunk of that regulation. So the impact of that, and the impact that DSA has on consumers, obviously, is they're receiving clearer, more reliable information, and it's reducing the risk of them buying unsafe or counterfeit goods. So a positive in that respect. And then transparency of platform reporting obligations. So DSA imposes a lot of reporting obligations on platforms. Or they've had the reporting obligations, but some of it's been more voluntary, and this kind of like makes it clear that this is a requirement of them. And to report effectively, they may rely on information or collaboration from sellers that are on their platform. So they must now publish regular detailed reports around the number of content removal actions, number of user appeals and outcomes, use of automated moderation tools, data on advertising and targeting, and so on and so forth. And that means that regulators, researchers, and the public itself, those users of the platform, can correctly scrutinize their behavior as well. But obviously, as these platforms face increased regulation, then they push that down as well. So they will be looking at you as sellers on those platforms to make sure that your product listings are absolutely what they need to be, and that all of that data is there, so that your product listings are safeguarded, they're not taken down, you don't receive a kind of notice to remove, and your EU trade is uninterrupted, which, let's face it, that's what we're all kind of like hoping for. Deep dive into advertising and algorithmic transparency. So DSA introduces probably some of the world's strictest, and I do have a slide on other global regulation and how similar it is to DSA, but it introduces some of the world's most strict transparency rules. So every ad must be clearly labeled as an advertisement. That's the first thing. So users must be able to see who paid for the ad, why they're seeing the ad, so what's that targeting criteria. Targeted advertising based on sensitive data is 100% banned, and targeted advertising to minors is prohibited. And platforms must maintain a public ad repository. So in that respect, the positive impact is the fact that users gained visibility into how ads are reaching them, and it reduces that kind of like covert targeting and manipulation. Okay, so it's a positive in that respect. There must be more transparency about algorithm, wearing somebody else's teeth, algorithm parameters and content curation. So platforms now must explain how algorithms decide what users see. So they have to describe the main parameters of their recommendation systems, how those parameters influence ranking and visibility, and users must be offered at least one option. Sorry, must be offered at least one non-personalized feed option. Okay, so in that sense, users of platforms gain more control over the algorithmic curation and can opt out of personalized feeds in that respect. Now, as I said earlier, there's been a huge increase in the amount of influencer marketing, and a lot of brands have had markets open up significantly to them through the use of influencer marketing. So it's had a very positive impact on revenues and profitability. However, there are some negative sides of it as well, which is what the DSA aims to target. So influencers under DSA have to make commercial content unmistakably identifiable. So any kind of like paid partnership or sponsorship, any gifted product or affiliate promotion must be clearly labelled as advertising. Okay, labels must be immediate, prominent and understandable. So advertisement, paid partnership, sponsored, so on. And actually, I've come off that platform now, but I did spend a little bit of time on TikTok a couple of months ago, and I'd noticed that I could see some changes in terms of the text overlay of some of those videos. Ambiguous tags like collab or thanks to or partnered with are no longer sufficient. Okay, so we're looking for real data, and platforms that offer the ability for influencer marketing must provide tools to help those influencers label their ads correctly. So that hidden advertising under DSA becomes illegal and transparency becomes mandatory. So much of DSA is around transparency, as is so much of EU regulation and full stop at the moment, transparency, traceability, back to source and so on. There has to be transparency around who's behind the promotion. So DSA requires clarity around who's paying for the content, and essentially users can see whether the content is organic or commercially motivated so they can make an informed decision. Specific rules for targeting minors obviously are implicit within or explicit within DSA. So influencer content aimed at or likely to be consumed or reached by minors is faces stricter rules. So targeted advertising to minors is strictly forbidden or prohibited. Influencers can't use personal data of minors to tailor content, and platforms have to reduce the risk of minors being exposed to harmful or manipulative commercial content, if that makes sense. So influencers or businesses using influencer marketing have to be really cautious when their audience includes young people. A ban on dark patterns, as we call it. So influencers and brands under DSA can't use manipulative design or messaging. So they can't rely on kind of deceptive urgency tactics, you know, only one left, buy now, don't miss out, that kind of stuff. We see it all the time, unless that's factually true. There can't be any misleading claims around scarcity or pricing or product performance, and no manipulative calls to action designed to pressure vulnerable users. So that influencer marketing has to be honest, it has to be non-manipulative and evidence-based. Now, you'll recall from a webinar that we did several months back now around empowering consumers for the green transition. So much of this is about giving consumers, users more powers, and making sure that they have more transparent information to help them make informed purchase decisions and informed investment decisions in brands. That kind of like vague terminology is no longer acceptable. Influencers have increased obligations to manage illegal or unsafe products. So if influencers are producing or promoting products that are sold online, the DSA imposes new duties. So they must ensure that the products they promote are legal and compliant with EU safety rules, absolutely. That the traders that they're promoting those products on behalf of are you know, solid, established businesses. And if a product is recalled or found unsafe, then influencers will have to update their content or remove their related content to that product. So it places a lot more obligations on influencers in the areas of illegal or unsafe products. So essentially, if you are advertising on social media or on e-commerce platforms, then obviously there's greater and enforceable demands for advertising transparency and ethical practices, so that the consumers or the users digesting that content or accessing that content are safeguarded, their rights are safeguarded and their well-being is safeguarded as well. Okay, so hopefully this is making sense. The DSA covers or provides a lot more clarity around illegal content and unsafe goods and how platforms need to manage that. So platforms have to explain how they handle illegal content, harmful content, and any kind of like user reports of illegal or harmful content. So their terms of service must be written in clear, accessible language, and platforms must disclose how content's moderated, whether automated tools are used, the criteria for removing or restricting content, and users must receive specific explanations when their content is removed or restricted. And if you remember from a previous slide, you have the right to appeal that decision to remove or restrict that content. So there has to be kind of like a structured appeals process. This essentially means that users of platforms understand fully why certain decisions are made and they can challenge them, and it reduces that kind of like arbitrary or opaque moderation, if you like. Some of you may or may not be aware, but platforms have an obligation under crisis situations, and DSA enforces transparency, full transparency in those crisis situations. So in the event of conflicts or pandemics or anything like that, those very large online platforms must share information about measures taken to address crisis-related risks, changes to algorithms or moderation policies, and they must cooperate with the EU Commission's crisis response mechanism. So this is another area that platforms are regulated under in the event of kind of like emergencies within the EU or within certain member states. It basically prevents platforms from quietly altering systems in a way which could amplify harm. So they're very regulated in those situations. They have under DSA, there is a requirement for them to strengthen enforcement around or against misleading commercial practices. So, as I say, going back to the influencers, they will regulate those influencers to prevent them from making false claims about products or services or the results of using those products or services. They'll be regulating specifically health, financial or performance claims to make sure that they're truly verifiable and they're substantiated. And influencers can be held accountable for promoting illegal services or scams, which kind of sounds, you know, as it should be, but the regulation now, you know, enforces it, doubles down on it. So there is now, you could say, a higher legal risk or more legal obligations for influencers who exaggerate or misrepresent products or services, for example. What else? Legally binding product safety obligations linked to EU GPSR and harmonised safety regulations. So those of you that have been on some of these webinars before will know that harmonised safety regulation is those vertical sector regulations, right? So the toy directives seem to become the toy regulation, the machinery directives seem to become the machinery regulation, and so on. So you've got GPSR, which is product safety, kind of like harmonised over all general products, and then you've got those vertical sector regulations. Essentially, those products that carry the CE mark typically are harmonised safety regulations. So platforms are legally bound to ensure that sellers are compliant with all EU product safety obligations linked to GPSR and those vertical sector regulations. So in addition to vetting and vetting traders to make sure that they're compliant, when a platform becomes aware that a product's illegal or unsafe, it has a whole raft of obligations to fulfill. So it has to remove or disable access by the consumer to those listings without delay, and they have very strict timelines by which they need to do that. They need to inform the trader whose product or service it is of the reason why it's been removed if the trader doesn't already know. They have to inform consumers who have purchased the product if the platform has their details. And then they have an obligation to liaise with and cooperate with market surveillance authorities and in some cases, police forces in various different member states. Platforms, they also have to quickly respond to notices from users of unsafe product or alerts from those competent authorities of unsafe product on the market, and they must act quickly on alerts from what we call trusted flaggers, which I'll mention later on. So as platforms face this more increased kind of like scrutiny or adherence to product safety information on product listings, then they push that down to the sellers. So, moving forward, there will be more ad hoc kind of audits of product listings and so on to make sure that the trader content is legal and verifiable, that the claims around the product are not false or deliberately vague or misleading. That could be around product safety. It could be moving forward around sustainability claims. With the Green Claims Directive, you'll hear me talking about how, saying sustainable is no longer going to be acceptable. We need to have verifiable sustainability claims and so on. So they're going to, as they take on the burden of responsibility here, then they push that down to their traders to make sure that those traders aren't exposing them to additional risk or non-compliance costs. And obviously platforms as well as traders have joint obligations when it comes to bringing product back into conformity. When I say bringing a product back into conformity, I'm basically talking about if there's an unsafe product on the market, retrieving that unsafe product in the most expeditious ways. Platforms and traders themselves have obligations when that product's been sold by an e-commerce platform. Terms and conditions clarity. So this is actually a positive, right, for UK sellers. So platforms have got to make sure that their T's and C's are clear, accessible, and in non-technical language. They have to be very explicit about their content moderation policies and make sure that there's clear explanations of the recommendation schemes, how they work, disclosure around advertising practices, and so on and so forth. So in many respects, that additional clarity and transparency around the platform's processes and practices are beneficial to UK companies when you rely upon them. So there's no more kind of like vague T's and C's. Everything's very explicit. You know where you stand. You know what their practices and processes are. However, as they become more strict in that respect, there's nothing to say that there isn't an expectation for those traders too to adopt that similar kind of transparent approach to their own T's and C's. But T's and C's, terms and conditions clarity, is very much in there in DSA as being paramount to users of the platform, be they users that consume the content or be those traders that rely on those platforms to sell their products and services. Another aspect is complaint handling and user rights. So the DSA dramatically strengthens complaint handling and user rights. It creates probably one of the most empowering regulatory frameworks in the world to date, and there are other markets that are implementing regulations similar to DSA in terms of its robustness, but this is very much out there as being the most user empowering regulatory framework. So platforms must provide clear, accessible internal complaint handling system information. So they have to make sure that there is a kind of free, easy to use complaint mechanism that allows users to challenge their decisions, basically. So, content removal or restrictions, account suspensions or terminations, demonetization or visibility reductions, removal of what they see to be illegal content, and so on and so forth. The system that they provide has to be user-friendly, not hidden, so it should be easily, and we've all been to those websites and platforms where you can't find, and I'm not going to mention one in particular, but I had an account that was hacked, and I went round the houses to try and find out how I could disable this account. I still haven't. It's still out there. I don't know what this Chinese business or individual is doing with it, but I just can't get to where I need to get to actually disable that account. So that's a classic example. So really, the DSA means that users have a more structured, a more enforceable way to challenge platform decisions. They have to receive detailed explanations around moderation decisions. So whenever a platform has removed or restricted content, it has to tell the user why why that rule was violated, why that content was removed, whether the decision was made by a human or by an automated system, how the decision impacts the user. So, in terms of visibility, monetization, and then there has to be notification of an appeals process as well. So there's no more kind of like vague, you violated our guidelines messages. Platforms need to justify their actions around moderation decisions. As I've said, that user empowerment, so users have the right to appeal all of these kind of decisions. The DSA actually creates a multi-layered approach to appeals processes. So initially there's an internal platform appeal. So users can challenge any moderation decision through the platform's own complaint system. But then there is a further step, which is about an out-of-court dispute settlement. So if the user disagrees with the platform's response, they can escalate that to an independent dispute settlement body certified by the EU. And those platforms, a little bit like ombudsman kind of thing, the platforms have to comply with that body's decision and jurisdiction. And then there's also judicial redress, which is the third layer. So users retain the right to take the matter to court after that. So you've got internal complaint system, kind of like an ombudsman process, and then court action if necessary. That's 3-layer approach. Users also gain stronger rights against automated decision making. So if a platform is using automated tools to remove content or suspend accounts or anything like that, then users have to be informed and given the right to have that content reviewed by a human. So that automated moderation that brings so many benefits to these platforms and makes, their ability to process such huge amounts of data can no longer operate as kind of like a black box. The users who have been impacted by those decisions have the option to challenge that decision. Users also have the right to report illegal content easily. So platforms need to provide kind of like simple, standardized notice and action mechanisms for reporting illegal content. And users must be able to submit notices without navigating those complex menus, if you like. Notices have to be acknowledged and processed quickly. So the reporting of illegal content becomes more transparent and consistent across platforms. That's the idea. So the way that you access that kind of illegal notice will be kind of like the same, irrespective of the platform that you're making that notice via. Users have to be informed when they're exposed to illegal products or unsafe goods as well. That's a biggie, really. So for online marketplaces, if a user bought, like I say, a product that was later found to be illegal, counterfeit, not just unsafe, but illegal or counterfeit, the platform has to notify them directly. And platforms have to provide information on remedies such as recalls or refunds and so on. So consumers are protected protected even after the purchase, and the platform plays a big part in that. And then obviously users gain transparency rights over advertising, so they can see who paid for the ad, why they're seeing it, what targeting criteria were used to reach them, and they have the right, importantly, to opt out of personalized ads. They have the right to avoid ads that are based on sensitive data and avoid targeted ads if they're minors. So advertising becomes more transparent and user controlled, which is really important. Just conscious of time here. So the impact on you guys as UK sellers is obviously, as there's greater demand and enforceability around trader cooperation to make sure platforms can handle complaints swiftly, then they can impose some of that on you guys. So if a product is deemed to be, unsafe, counterfeit, illegal, or so on, they're going to need collaboration from you as traders to bring that product back into conformity, and to handle customer complaints swiftly and correctly. So the complaint handling and user rights particularly make up a big part of DSA, and we see that as having a potential impact on you as UK sellers. Legal representative. I don't want anybody panicking here around, oh my God, not another authorised representative. It's not. And it's if an online platform, the 5 that we mentioned at the very beginning, is not established in the EU, then they need to appoint a legal representative if it offers its services to EU users. So it's not you, the traders, it's the platforms that need to appoint an EU authorised representative. And we're seeing this with a lot of EU regulation. They want that compliance and those conversations with competent authorities to be held locally, i.e. via an individual or a company established in the EU. They don't want to be having to chase platform providers across the other end of the other side of the world, for example. They want to control that compliance locally within the EU. So not much more to say about that other than they have to make that if there is a requirement for a legal representative and they have to appoint one, then the details of that legal representative have to be clearly visible on their site. As with all legal representatives, they have to be based in the EU, or there's some other kind of not derogations, but for example, under GPSR, an authorised representative can be based in Northern Ireland, for example, even though Northern Ireland isn't a 27 member state, isn't one of the 27 member states. We will probably see more and more authorised reps based in Ireland, maybe Luxembourg, the Netherlands and Germany, just because of established tech regulation infrastructure is really quite strong there. So I don't want you guys to worry. It's not, as a trader, you need to appoint a legal representative under DSA. It's not that at all. It's the platform's obligation. But a big part of the regulation focuses on that. Very conscious of time here, so I'm going to skip this slide. And talk about surveillance and risks of non-compliance, because that does have an impact on you guys as sellers, because as tighter surveillance starts to bite the platforms, they become more demanding of their traders to make sure your practices and your data doesn't expose them or their platforms to undue risks and non-compliance costs. So what are they facing in terms of surveillance? What are they up against? So I think I mentioned at the very beginning, the DSA creates a kind of multi-layered oversight system. So platforms are continuously monitored, especially those very large online platforms, those VLOPs, or those very large online search engines. And it's not about the EU Commission or the regulated authority spying on users. It's not Big Brother watching you as using the platform. I'm not saying that doesn't happen. I mean, Alexa keeps popping up every time. She's probably going to say hello now because I've mentioned her name. But conspiracy theories aside, it's not about Big Brother's watching you. It's about scrutinizing those platforms' practices and algorithms and risk management. That's what it's about. But obviously, I mentioned about the transparency of reporting. So the fact that these platforms have to provide detailed annual reports around content moderation, around automated moderation tools, number of appeals and outcomes, and so on. So that means that regulators, importantly, and also researchers that are looking into changing trends of consumer habits and so on, can track platform behaviour over time, which is really important. They're also subject to independent audits. Those big ones are subject to independent audits that are kind of instructed by the EU Commission. So those audits examine things like algorithmic systems, content moderation processes, risk assessments, and so on. And those auditors can demand internal documents, data, and explanations. And fundamentally, it means that those platforms are facing, just as we do as traders, right? If you're exporting or if you're importing, you can face an audit by HMRC to make sure that your processes, practices, documentation, and so on are all in line. Then platforms are subject to the same kind of scrutiny via an external body on their internal systems. So, it's perfectly good practice. Data access, they have to provide data access for vetted researchers, like I say. So those very large online platforms have to provide secure access for researchers who want to study disinformation, harms to minors, electoral manipulation, algorithmic amplification, anything that those vetted researchers need to research that they can use data from those very large online platforms, they have to be given access to that. So academics gain unprecedented visibility into platform operations now, and actually you could say user habits and trends over time. Those very large online platforms have unprecedented scrutiny via the EU Commission itself. So, the Commission acts as the primary regulator, and then each member state will have its own kind of, local regulator, if you like. But the EU Commission is very much the primary regulator, and it has powers to request documents, conduct interviews, demand algorithmic explanations, inspect internal systems, launch formal investigations. So the EU now can directly monitor and intervene in platform governance across all 27 member states. What are the risks and consequences of non-compliance? Well, look, they're quite significant. So there are always, we break them down, and you see this in regulation, enforcement and market surveillance across the board. Really, there are several different categories of risk. So financial, so under DSA there can be fines of up to 6% of global annual turnover, not just EU turnover, but global annual turnover, for platforms that are found to be non-compliant. So that's kind of like a fiscal fine, if you like. There can be, after that fine, there can be daily fines for failure to provide certain information. So it's massive. This is big stuff. Obviously, operational risks. So if they're forced to make changes to algorithms, or they've got to enforce mandatory suspension of certain features, this is operational risk, but also translates to kind of like fiscal penalty as well, if you like. Legal, there can be formal investigations by the Commission. Obviously, there can be legally binding orders to comply. There can be liability for damages under national law, and court actions initiated by users and consumer groups. Now, that's a big one, right? Because that is part of the empowering consumers for the green transition as well. That increased powers to users to keep those big organisations, hold them to account through legal proceedings, and the DSA provides that also. But then again, with all of this, so much of it can be reputational risk. Okay, so that public transparency reports, those, if they expose kind of like failures on behalf of the organisation, or negative audit reports become public, or, media scrutiny increases around certain non-compliance, loss of user trust, damage to brand credibility, and so on. That's all quite significant and has significant costs attributed to it. Now, there are extreme measures as well. So in the most severe cases, the DSA allows the EU to impose temporary service restrictions so that the platform can be taken down, essentially. It can be temporarily restricted from operating in the EU this is really extreme measures. So if it's repeatedly and seriously violated the DSA, or if it refuses to comply with enforcement actions, this is kind of like those extreme measures are like a last resort, but it is legally possible. There are the powers under the DSA to do that. So I think, as I said, as the tighter surveillance measures bite the platforms themselves, and they become more demanding of you traders to make sure that their practices, or your practices rather, don't overly expose the platforms to undue risk and non-compliance costs. Motoring on, I'm just going to let you read this slide at your leisure, but here are other equivalent regulations. So the UK has the Online Safety Act, which is one of the closest equivalents to EU DSA, as is Australia's Online Safety Act and Brazil's Fake News Bill. But then there are other regulation globally that aims to do similar things. The US obviously is always going to be challenging because it's a federal state system, so there's a patchwork of sectoral laws. There's no single DSA style law, but there are several proposals and existing state laws that kind of overlap with DSA themes, and I've listed what some of those are there. There are also being a federal state system, there are certain states that can introduce their own acts. California has a couple, I believe, that are very similar or overlap with certain DSA themes. So the USA is always a bit of a challenging one to navigate. Not impossible, but just a little bit different, because really you should treat the US, or we always say to our clients when they're embarking on US, you almost treat the US as a group of individual countries rather than one single country, because some of them operate very differently to others. So what should you be doing in terms of a compliance checklist? So I think the first thing is to understand whether DSA applies to you. So I'm not thinking it does directly apply to anyone on this call. I don't think we've got any Google or Facebook or, I don't know, Amazon people on this call this morning, but essentially there are certain questions that you ask yourself to make sure to determine whether DSA directly impacts you. So if you offer goods, services or content to EU-based users through an online platform, you advertise to EU audiences via social media or marketplaces, you operate as a trader on an EU-facing marketplace, you run a UK-based platform that has EU users even if you have no EU office, you use EU-based intermediaries hosting cloud search engines, so on. If any of those apply, then DSA affects you, but not necessarily directly. So you guys on the call today that are EU e-commerce sellers, hopefully I've explained that you're indirectly impacted, and that as tighter regulation grips those platforms, they're going to be looking to you to comply, if that makes sense. Appointing a legal representative, hopefully I have covered that. That's just exclusively for the platform, a non-EU based platform that is reaching EU users needs to have an EU-based legal representative. What else was I going to say? So I think from where you sit today, it's about making sure that you're anticipating what the platforms are going to be asking for, those platforms that you use. So making sure that your trader information on those platforms is top-notch and very detailed, very accurate, and regularly reviewed is absolutely paramount. If you're using advertising or influencer marketing, that it's labeled clearly, as we've gone through. And again, you'll get a copy of these slides and a link to the recording, which we'll post on our YouTube channel, so you can go over that. That product safety and compliance information, it feels like that's all we were talking about last year as GPSR was taking hold. But obviously, product listings do have to have GPSR and product safety regulatory compliance data on there. So making sure that your product listings contain all of that data, and indeed any other regulation that you're complying with, voluntarily or mandatory, where you have the ability to put that information on the product listing, the better. I mean, as we see digital product passports come in, they're going to be like just game changing, because all of the data, you know, all of that, well, there's really ethical producers and manufacturers that voluntarily comply with regulation because that's in their DNA. They want to be safe, they want to be sustainable. That can be difficult to put on a product listing, but heck, you can have it on the product moving forward, or on its packaging or whatever. But that GPSR code will be that GPSR code, that QR code, too many acronyms. That QR code is like the gateway to, well, there's no limit as to what you can put on there to help your users make more informed decisions about purchasing your products over and above somebody else's, to helping market surveillance authorities see what they need to see, to help your distributors and importers see what they need to see. And then as the EU moves solidly towards its kind of like full digitization, for customs being able to see what they need to see to process goods. So digital product passports, they're super exciting. But anyway, back to product listings, making sure that your product safety and compliance information is on the product listing, making sure that your T's and C's and content practices align with DSA. I know the majority of that is on, you know, on the platforms to address or comply with in DSA. But it's always good to review regularly your T's and C's for your EU users, and helping them, you know, understand your practices and your processes and your terms in a clear way, no technical jargon and so on. It's good practice. Implement complaints and appeal mechanisms if operating a platform. Absolutely, it's for the platform to do, but as businesses, we should all have a kind of like complaints and appeal system, certainly a complaints system, and that should be, you know, clearly available via our website or any kind of like documentation. It just demonstrates that you are an ethical business that places, you know, your customers' well-being at the very heart of what you do. Ignore the appointing EU legal representative unless you're one of those non-EU based platforms, and prepare for audits, reporting, and cooperation with EU authorities. That's for the platforms, but don't forget that the platforms, the additional powers that they're given under DSA allows them to do those kind of like ad hoc spot checks on sellers using their platforms. So a little bit like those HMRC audits that you get notification of 1 in 3 days time or something like that. We'll start to see more and more of those for platforms vetting their own sellers, if you like. What can you do to prepare? So this is kind of like a practical, action orientated checklist for you sellers. I am getting that kind of like 5 minutes, like that. I've gone 5 minutes over. Oh my goodness. I'm so sorry, everyone. I will wrap up really quickly. I think the first thing is to map your EU exposure. So, you know, identify all your EU facing platforms that you use, your Amazons, your EUs, your Etsy's, TikTok, so on and so forth. Identify any EU facing websites, apps or services you operate. Identify all EU facing advertising campaigns and influencer partnerships, and identify all EU facing product listings and marketplaces. Why does that matter? Well, because as they're tightening, as the platforms are tightening enforcement, then you will know where you're exposed, and you'll know how to prepare if you know where you're listed and where your exposure is. Ensure your business identity information is complete. So we've mentioned that. Update your, make sure that your legal name, address, company number, VAT, contact details, everything is updated. It's really difficult, like when you change, say, your correspondence address, to remember everywhere where that needs to be changed. But it's really, really important, because that incomplete or inconsistent trader information is now a top reason for account suspension on those EU marketplaces. Make sure that your product safety and compliance documentation is top notch. We've talked about that. Strengthen your transparency in advertising. So we've talked a bit about how the DSA is enforcing ad transparency rules. So make sure you understand, if you're using digital advertising or influence advertising, what your obligations are around that, to make sure that that's fully compliant. Review your content moderation and user interaction policies. So that is kind of like for the platforms themselves, but also how do you document how you manage complaints and appeals. Make sure you're fully compliant in that respect. Terms and conditions we've talked about. Legal representative, we've said probably not needed for you guys on the call today. And stay on top of evolving platform rules. So as I've said on all these webinars that we do, as we know, you will know, as there are significant changes, then we'll make sure that they're pushed out via our channels so that you know how things are changing. Last slide is about available GTD support, which you're quite welcome to peruse at your leisure. The Global Trade Clinic is our 15-minute kind of like free of charge. We much prefer to get on a call, answer your questions, rather than you sat there scratching your head or stressing. So book one of those. What I would say at the minute is we are absolutely fit to bursting with inquiries around a whole raft of products, around a whole raft of regulation and so on. So our response times are definitely not what we would like them to be, but we will get round to you in time. And obviously the 15-minute clinics, you can book those online for our next availability. And yada yada, that's it. I am so sorry, I had no idea I had gone so far over time. If you need to nip off the call straight away, that's absolutely fine.